Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Sharmila Sen. I'm the author of Not Quite, Not White. My arrival day to this country was August 11th, 1982. Most people who are first-generation immigrants know their arrival day. So those of you among here in this room who, if you came to this country as a child or an adult, or if your parents did, you should ask them what their first day or their memory of their first arrival day was like. I later looked up and I found out that in 1982, about 500,000 people became legal immigrants to the United States. And I think if we count the undocumented, that number is even greater. And that number gives me great comfort today, so many years later, because now I know we were never alone. But back in 1982, I thought I was alone. I felt very alone. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is that for people, who are newly arrived into this country, as I once was, for whom English is not their first language, who are learning to maybe read and write in English, learning to wear clothes that are different from what they're used to, speak in an accent they're not used to, develop a taste for music or food that they're not used to, that you're never alone. And there have been others before you, and just as there were others before me, and there'll be others to come. But that's not the only reason, actually, I wrote this book. And I want to just tell you a short story which has to do with my children. I have 3 children, 17, 16, and 13. And my oldest child, my daughter, was born in India, and we adopted her when she was a few months old. And my 2 sons I gave birth to in this country. So the 2 sons are the only native-born Americans in our home, right? The rest of us, we are all first-gen immigrants. And when my son, who just turned 16 a couple of days ago, when he was around, I think in 2nd or 3rd grade, he had an assignment. He had an immigration assignment in school. We live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. As many of you know, Massachusetts is a blue state, fairly liberal, progressive. My 3 kids attend the public schools of Cambridge. In fact, I immigrated to Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1982, and I went through that same public school system. So these kids were, they always have an assignment on immigration. And this was around, must be around 8-9 years ago. And so he had to interview an immigrant. It was a very easy assignment for him because his house is filled with immigrants. So he came to Mama and, said, all the usual questions. What was your, what was the first day like? What was the first year like? Were you happy? So I started telling him about, well, I didn't quite like the food and I had to learn to speak in another language. English is my 3rd language. I grew up speaking Bengali. I'm an ethnic Bengali. I learned Hindi as my 2nd language, which is the national language of the country in which I was born. And then I learned English. And I said, and I had to, I didn't quite like the oregano in pizza, and I really just didn't like the soda that came in those cans. And I saw his face. He was just getting kind of sad. And I realized, oh my God, my son doesn't, of course, first, who wants to hear that their mother wasn't filled with utmost delight when they had arrived in the country of their own birth, right? And secondly, I realized that in school he had been taught that, immigrants are heroes. Ellis Island is an American icon. Because that's the progressive kind of politics of the school he goes to. But something there struck me. Because I think today, and I've had many years to think about this conversation with my son, as you can guess, I've had over 3 decades thinking about what it means to be American, what Americanization means, By the way, this is not a spoiler. I will just tell you one thing about my book is I no longer need to be Americanized, because to be Americanized is precisely not to be American. And the day, thank you. And the day you realize you no longer need to be Americanized is the day you realize you have truly become American. And I'll get to what I mean by that. But one of the things I realized is that whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, right or left, whether you think immigration is good for America or whether you think it's bad for America, whether you think certain kinds of immigrants are what we need or whether you think no immigrants are good, there's one thing that the schools were teaching my children, which is, and this gets to the heart of what I think is an American national myth. It is kind of our narrative, right? Which is, this is the last and final destination. We are as a city upon a hill. Everybody wants to come here. When they come here, they want to stay. Those who are not here, they also want to be here, right? I had a hard time with this. And I remembered a time when I didn't live in this country, and I had to write a letter to the man who was sponsoring my father for a green card. And in this letter, I'm around 10 years old, I had to look up a dictionary because I was told, I have to be I have to write in a neat cursive hand, I have to make sure my grammar is correct. And I looked up 2 words in my father's dictionary back in 1980. One was the word emigrate, E-M-I-G-R-A-T-E. And the other is the word immigrate, I-M-M-I-G-R-A-T-E. When I was writing this book, I opened up Merriam-Webster's again to refresh my memory. And I remembered the 10-year-old me very carefully writing that I looked forward to emigrating to the United States. And then a couple of years later, when I did come to this country, the rules of grammar dictated a change in the suffix, right? And I had become an immigrant. And I doubt many native-born Americans have had the reason or the opportunity to look up and learn the difference between an immigrant or an immigrant when they're 10 years old. Why is that? I think that is the privilege of rich countries. That is the privilege of powerful countries. Because even if in our most progressive modes we want to welcome immigrants amongst us, we somehow get very nervous when we think of immigrating anywhere ourselves. And this is what, so when my son's face got all sad, and I was like, oh, no, but everything was okay. Mama learned English. She learned to eat the food. She learned which Duran she should like, and Duran, it's the 80s, right? I learned to peg my pants, and when I had an asymmetrical haircut, I was very cool. I was like totally full-on Americanized. I danced to Run DMC, to Prince, to all of that. I said, she went to college, she met your father, she got married, she has you all. I'm not lonely anymore, I even dream in English. And one day, when you go somewhere, when you immigrate, this will happen. I have to immigrate? And I realized that even in my kids' public schools, which are quite, delightfully open-minded about migration, they wanted to teach our kids to celebrate immigrants, but they left our kids afraid of becoming immigrants. And one of the things I think is before, and I told my son, he said, why? Why do I have to leave? I like this country, I like the food, I have friends, I have family. I said, so did I, where I came from. Most people, we liked where we lived. I liked the language I spoke. I loved my cousins. I loved my grandparents. I loved the food. I didn't come here because I hated all those things, and this is the story. I said, one day, maybe it will be the forces of nature, politics, or economics that will make you move somewhere else. And just like your ancestors before you, you'll be okay. You will find success and failure. You will find love and disappointment. And perhaps you will create, or your children, an American diaspora, which is, by the way, very different from an expat community. You know the difference between expats and immigrants, right? Expats are people who move into a society that they kind of look down upon, and immigrants are people who move into a society they look up to. So I said, maybe one day before this century is over, you or your children will form American diasporas elsewhere. And just like immigrants all over the world, because that's what social science teaches us, that populations keep moving if you look at broad, moments of history. And also, most migrations are not permanent in one direction. Most people in the world who are moving, this has always been the truth, always is the truth. I think the US has a very skewed view of this. They don't go one place and stay put. They move back and forth, right? So I said, maybe one day you will be an immigrant somewhere. You will nurture a little America inside of you. Maybe you will be a little embarrassed and you'll hide it. Maybe you will celebrate your festivals privately. Maybe you will be proud. Maybe you'll forget your language. You'll learn another language. Your children will one day come and say, teach me that language you spoke in America, and you'll teach them American. You'll become different from the cousins you left in the homeland. And that's okay. And the homeland you left behind will be okay too. Because societies and civilizations and nations that have sent immigrants to this country didn't all just simply collapse, right? And this is so fundamentally difficult. I saw this in my son. And oh, by the way, I did want to go also to my kids' middle school and give a little lecture. My husband stopped me from doing that. Because I said, you don't want to be that mom. So I just, decided to work it into a chapter in a book instead. I thought, I don't want my kid to get bad grades because, they'd have that kind of crazy, pushy mom. But I said, to my son, that you will always remember, no matter where you have to go, just like I remembered where I came from, you will too. And that's when I realized, that's what I began with when I said that, that once I was an immigrant, wanting to move or having to move. I came here and I became an immigrant and I Americanized, and a lot of my book is about that. It's about sort of, what I call total Americanization, capital T, capital A. But now, being American with no further need for Americanization, I know that you've really arrived when you're no longer afraid of departure. Because now I can go anywhere, I can be stripped of my citizenship. I'm a naturalized citizen, and any naturalized citizen, by the way, knows this. This has nothing to do with the present political moment. This has been part of US immigration law from the beginning. That which is given can be taken away, right? This is true in most countries in the world. Naturalized citizens live with the kind of precarity that people who are born citizens don't always appreciate, because that which is given can always be taken away. But even if it's taken away from me, I can go someplace, and that thing that I've learned, the American I have become, I will carry with me. Much like, and I'll just remind us based on where we are, Caesar's palace, and I was thinking of ancient Rome and the founding myth of Rome. Rome is founded after the battle of, that's the story of the Aeneid. Aeneas comes from Troy after Troy has fallen, and he's the founder, right? And he carries with him the household gods. The Romans call them the lares, the household gods, and that's the foundation of Rome. He said, wherever I go, I know I will carry my household gods with me. Thank you.